You wouldn't realize it from Susan Sontag's notes on camp, but the associations between camp and the traditions of queer performance go back to at least the 19th century in the United Kingdom. For example, we can find the term in the correspondence of Fanny Park, who was one half of the fascinating Victorian cross-dressing double act Bolton and Park. Thomas Ernest Bolton and Frederick William Park were familiar figures in London's West End for their stage show as Stella Clinton and Fanny Park. They were also known for attending public events such as parties and theatrical openings, sometimes in male and sometimes in female dress. They were also eventually the subjects of a high-profile London trial, when they were charged with inciting persons to commit an unnatural offence. But both were acquitted, in part because the wearing of women's clothing by men was not actually illegal. A letter by Park, published in the Observer newspaper in 1870, appears to comment ironically on her theatrical career in the following terms. My campish undertakings are not at the present meeting with the success that they deserve. Whatever I do seems to get me into hot water somewhere, but n'importe, what's the odds so long as you're happy? Believe me, your affectionate sister-in-law, Fanny. Now, even this brief fragment suggests an extraordinary variety of linguistic registers. The slight circumlocution of not at present meeting with the success they deserve is a reminder of Park's educated background as the child of a successful barrister from Surrey, while n'importe is a bit of throwaway French, or perhaps even an instance of the slangy vocabulary of Polari, about which I will have more to say, but essentially the equivalent to a modern whatever. And then, with that final clause, Park dips into a lovely bit of phonetic East End London, a distinctively working-class accent that involves the dropping of the H from the word happy, so that it rolls with the R of your. What's the odds as long as you're happy? This single sentence is written with such stylistic flair that it makes you wish Fanny Park had written a whole book. And I haven't even yet commented on the fact that this is the earliest printed use of the term campish as an adjective, and that term is clearly intended to describe Park's theatrical rebellion against sex and gender norms. The OED seems to have picked up on this sense by the early 20th century, when it included a definition for camp as an adjective synonymous with ostentation, exaggerated, affected, theatrical, effeminate, or homosexual, listing the etymology as obscure. If you browse around online, you will find a variety of suggestions for the origin. For example, that the term comes from the French se camper, to pose, to be extravagant, or even that it is an acronym derived from the phrase known as male prostitute, although this is more likely to be a back formation or backronym. But perhaps the most interesting answer is that it originates as a term of slang speech from the subcultural language known as Polari, sometimes described as a lost LGBT language, and the subject of this book by Paul Baker. Polari is a linguistic treasure trove that mixes bits of French, Italian, Romany, Cockney rhyming slang, Yiddish, thieves' cant, and it was widely used within London's queer subculture as a form of code at a time when homosexuality was illegal. According to Paul Baker, some of the earliest Polari words date back to the 18th century, and Molly slang, the Molly subculture being an early queer urban subculture in the UK. But it also uses terms associated with the culture of the popular marketplace, music halls, travelling fairgrounds, and street performers. In the 19th century, Polari became increasingly associated with gay culture, and, as we've already seen, Fanny Park's correspondence employs what looks like Polari slang. As Baker notes, Polari developed a vocabulary for articulating taboo desires, words relating to gay sex or evaluating male bodies, but Polari also demonstrates an alternative value system. Central terms of that lexicon include boner, meaning good, cod or naff, meaning tacky or bad, trade, meaning sex, and of course the use of the word camp with its various overtones of outrageousness, theatricality, and queerness. I first heard Polari slang when I was a child, in the performances of the brilliant British entertainer Kenneth Williams. Williams was a famous voice and face in post-war British entertainment, known for his starring roles in the once popular Carry On films. He appeared in 26 of them, as well as regular radio appearances. These included a stint as half of a camp comedy duo with actor Hugh Paddock called Julian and Sandy, who were regular guests on the BBC comedy radio programme Round the Horn, named after the central star of the show, Kenneth Horne. In the words of Wikipedia, Julian and Sandy were notable for being two stereotypical camp homosexual characters in mainstream entertainment at a time when homosexual acts between men were illegal in the United Kingdom. The writers and cast thought the characters worked very well, as they were not simply there to be the target of a joke. In fact, most of the sketches revolved around Kenneth Horne being the target of their jokes. Here's an excerpt just to give you the flavour of Julian and Sandy at their best. The first voice that you will hear is that of Kenneth Horne, the straight man, if you'll pardon the expression, and then you'll hear Hugh Paddock as Julian, and finally the distinctive nasal tones of Kenneth Williams as Sandy.
Now, elections are cropping up all the time, but one that escaped notice was in my area. The usual parties were represented, Labour, Conservative and Liberal, but there was one party I'd never heard of before. And the slogan on their posters read, "Keep Britain Boner." And I decided to find out more about them, so I popped down to their party headquarters. Hello, anybody there?
Oh, hello, I'm Julian, and this is my friend Sandy.
Oh, hello! Yes, we are the Universal Party, so called because we're at it right, left and centre. Yes, shake hands with your prospective member. Shake hands. That's him.
That's me, Mr. Horne.
You, Julian?
Yes, I stand behind the working man.
And I stand behind him. Yes, he does. He's lovely. He's a lovely fellow, he is. And I stand behind Jewel. I'm his campaign manager.
Oh. He's an old campaigner, Mr.
Yes.
Horne.
You don't tell no lies.
Now, why have you formed your own party?
That's a good question.
Well, we couldn't see eye to eye with the other major parties. We left the Labour Party because we disagreed with the prescription charges.
And we fell out with the Conservatives because blue is now colour.
Oh, makes me right washed out.
It makes him look washed out, it does.
Oh.
Yes, we didn't like the colour of their favours, so then we was liberal with our favours for a while. For a while. Yes. Then we felt personally betrayed by the action of our liberal member.
Oh, what did he do?
Oh, I can't bring myself to say it, Mr. Horne.
Oh.
He should I tell him? He went and got married.
Don't carry on, Jewel.
I can't help it.
Jewel, pull yourself together. It's to no avail.
Disaster.
Pull yourself together. What's done is done.
Well.
Now blow your nose on your rosette.
So then we thought they've all let us down, so it's time for a change.
So we changed?
Yes. We formed our own party.
And what's your policy?
Well, we have a three-pronged manifesto.
We have, Mr. Horne. No, we have. Three
Yes.
distinct prongs it's got.
Yes.
Yeah, show him, Jewel. Get out your manifesto.
Oh, yes. Well, our points are these. 1, double the building programme so there's lattice for all.
Lattice for all.
Lattice for all.
Lovely. Remove the American missiles from our shores.
Oh, yes. Particularly that one, what's it called now? Polari.
That Polari, yes. Our third prong, free crow's feet cream for all.
Yes. Irrespective of race, creed or sex.
There, that's your incentive boner.
And what about old age pension?
Don't you worry, Mr. Sontag, we'll see you all right.
Make special provision for the over 60s.
But the smaller sizes won't be left out neither.
I think I can confidently say that I expect a huge poll.
His name's Vladimir, always pops round. Always pops round of a Wednesday evening,
Yes,
he
old
does.
friend of Gordon's. he
Gordon,
was.
yes, Gordon's his friend.
Nowadays, few would hesitate to enrol Williams within a tradition of queer British performance, but it seems important to note that for British gay men of his age and era, the term queer would have carried extremely abusive and derogatory connotations. Indeed, it would have sounded to his ears more like the word faggot sounds to American ears. But Williams had no problem acknowledging his performance style as camp. Given that even the Oxford English Dictionary seems to have recognized the connections between camp and queerness by 1909, not to mention the identification of performers such as Williams with the concept in the public mind, Sontag's Notes on Camp has sometimes struck readers as curiously evasive on this association. She doesn't even mention what she calls the peculiar relation between camp taste and homosexuality until notes 50 to 53. And when she does, one of the things she says is that camp taste is much more than homosexual taste. A statement that some readers have interpreted very negatively. The critic D.A. Miller has even gone so far as to accuse Sontag of making the phobic dehomosexualization of camp the necessary condition of any intelligent discourse on the subject. I think the normally acute Miller has missed something important here, however. It's worth bearing in mind that the word homosexual at the time Sontag was writing would have been understood to mean presumptively white gay men exclusively, rather than a wider world of possible queer subject positions. So when Sontag says that camp taste is much more than homosexual taste, it's reasonable to argue that she is not so much trying to make camp less queer in some phobic way, but to open the question of what camp taste might mean when it includes but is not limited to the perspective of white gay men. Indeed, while Sontag has also been criticized for ignoring race in her notes, her recognition of the affinities between camp and homosexuality, and her simultaneous insistence that it can include more, actually leaves the door open for a discussion of camp and race. When it comes to camp, I think Sontag was less interested in phobic dehomosexualization than in a big tent vision of the camp concept, one that would not only include black camp, but also lesbian camp, feminist camp, gender-fluid camp, and so on. This sense that camp is just more interesting if it is not seen as the property of a single identity position emerges out of what Sontag expresses elsewhere as a kind of ambivalence towards the concept. As Anne Pellegrini has argued in what I think is one of the best responses to Sontag's work, ambivalence is the structuring condition of Sontag's Notes on Camp, and, indeed, of her relationship to camp more broadly. This ambivalence is partly rooted in Sontag's feminism, as Pellegrini also notes, citing an interview Sontag gave in 1975, in which she makes clear that she wanted feminists to see past what may offend them in camp in order to take in some of its liberatory force. And this is a quote from that interview. In camp, the parodistic rendering of women usually left me cold. But I can't say that I was simply offended, for I was as often amused and, so far as I needed to be, liberated. Camp's extremely sentimental relation to beauty is no help to women, but its irony is. Ironizing about the sexes is one small step towards depolarizing them. This desire for a form of irony that depolarizes the sexes and complicates our understanding of gender binarism can also help us to understand the value that Sontag places on camp as an aesthetic that draws attention to its own artifice, in the form of objects that say, "I am an object," or performances that say, "I am a performance," or indeed, men and women who declare, "I am a woman," or "I am a man." That is, men and women whose gender presentation declares itself in such a way that we can't miss its contrived artificial quality. Sontag gives the example in note number 9 of what she calls the corny, flamboyant femaleness of Jane Mansfield, or the exaggerated he-manness of Steve Reeves. These performances of gender, she is suggesting, are so over the top that we start to recognize that they are anything but natural, that they are, in fact, a kind of drag. This idea might be clearer if I use a more contemporary example. Here is an image of the drag artist Trixie Mattel as Dolly Parton, next to an image of Dolly Parton as Dolly Parton, where Mattel is clearly not mocking or parodying Dolly Parton, but paying tribute to Parton's own theatrical performance of hyperfemininity, in the process revealing Parton to be a kind of drag artist in her own right. The point here is larger than the by now well-worn claim that gender is socially constructed, because the camp performer turns that observation into the basis of a kind of refusal, a refusal to reduce their sense of identity to their gender designation or sexual preferences. This is why it misses the point to ask of a camp performer, but do you identify more as a woman or as a man? Or indeed to ask, but are you really gay? Camp is a sensibility that refuses to reduce the complexity of human interiority to a simple one-time-fits-all declaration of identity or orientation. Lest I've been misunderstood, I'm not saying that a person's gender designation or sexual preferences bear no relation to their sense of identity, just insisting that our sense of identity can depend on a good deal more, and that it might be unhelpful to reduce our sense of self to these categories. The camp emphasis on the performance of gender allows identity itself to become more labile, capacious, and interesting. At the same time, I should acknowledge that there have always been less happy reasons for developing ways of declaring queerness without declaring queerness. In a society that rules certain expressions of love and desire unnatural, ungodly, and illegal, it is perfectly understandable why people might find coded ways of expressing those forms of love and desire. And the frisson of camp depends to a large extent on this double mode of address. It's not simply queerness as outrageousness and theatricality, but something more paradoxical. It is queerness that is simultaneously expressed and disguised by outrageousness and theatricality. On the one hand, to people in the know, it declares itself as queerness. On the other hand, it can always work as a kind of beard or mask. I'm just being outrageous. Camp, in other words, is an aesthetic of the closet. For those in the know, however, it's a closet made of glass. This raises the question of what happens to the camp sensibility in a less closeted world. Does it require some version of the closet for its frisson? Is it an increasingly historical phenomenon? If camp extracts power from blurring the boundary between straight and gay, what does that mean in our present moment when that blurring has become much more mainstream? I hope we can discuss this further in our meeting next week, or of course you can discuss it with your GEs, but there can be no doubt that for some, camp is a thing of the past. The great film director John Waters, a visionary genius behind several camp classics, said in an interview a few years ago, "I don't know anyone that would ever say the word camp out loud. It's like an 80-year-old gay man in a 1950s antique shop under a Tiffany lampshade." So for Waters, at least at the moment of this interview, camp was the very definition of old-fashioned. It may also be the case that the very doubleness of classic camp now sometimes works against our appreciation of it. The need to signal queerness without seeming to signal queerness may simply be too much of a reminder of an oppressive past that made such secrecy and coding necessary. On the other hand, if camp is increasingly a historical phenomenon, then engaging with camp may also be a way of celebrating our queer ancestors, learning their codes, grasping their sensibility, and learning to appreciate their talent as performers all over again. And on that note, I'll give the last word to the great Kenneth Williams.
The camp performance.
Well, I believe the word camp has actually found its way into the addenda of the OED.
I beg your pardon?
It's found its way into the addenda of the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, and it's defined there as that which is fundamentally frivolous. And I suppose that's about the nearest you'd get to an academic definition of it. What I think the general, current interpretation of the word is always that which is verging on the effeminate, that sort of thing, which is ludicrous to say that about me because I've personified what you might call the butch element in light entertainment for some time now.
Yes,